Many thanks to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this program. Over the next 60 minutes, I will highlight some key moments in the history of the recognition of the genocide of the Sinti and Roma. I will ask why recognition came so late and what consequences this had and continues to have for the survivors and their family. And I, of course, would like to stress that the history of the struggle for recognition is of particular importance for any educational process. As far as I understood, this is one of your main topics in this gathering here and during the next couple of days. So let me begin with a quote from survivor Sonny Weiss, who was born in The Hague, in Netherlands in 1937. In an interview conducted around 2016, Sonny Weiss said, "I'm a Sinto and the situation of our people, the Sinti and Roma, is distressing. I lost my entire family during the National Socialist era. This is something that must never happen again. But society has learned next to nothing. I want our young people to have a future. They should no longer suffer from marginalization, but have equal access to education and work." End of quote. Sonny Weiss represents all survivors who, after 1945, wanted nothing more than to receive recognition for the suffering they had endured and to help shape a society in which crimes against humanity, such as the genocide committed against the Sinti and Roma, could never happen again. And they wanted to finally live free from discrimination so that their children could have a better future. It was also Sonny Weiss who gave his autobiography, published in 2016, the programmatic title, The Forgotten Holocaust. This is programmatic in several respects. On the one hand, it integrates the genocide of the Sinti and Roma into the familiar narrative of the Holocaust, highlighting the fact that the persecution was racially motivated and aimed at the extermination of the entire minority. But he also emphasizes that the persecution and murder of hundreds of thousands of Sinti and Roma has been forgotten. But can we really say that these crimes have simply been forgotten? I doubt that. Isn't it not rather, and much worse, that these acts were never regarded as crimes, but that segregation, imprisonment, and deportation were understood as a legitimate means of combating an alleged plague? Today, we certainly can't no longer say that the genocide of the Sinti and Roma has been forgotten. Thanks to decades of commitment by survivors, which I will discuss later, there are many remarkable initiatives to communicate this topic on a broader basis. As mentioned before, one example is the recommendations of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance for teaching and learning about the persecution and genocide of the Roma during the Nazi era. They were adopted, already said before, in London in December 2024 by the 35 member states and are based on the recommendations previously issued by the IHRA on teaching and learning about the Holocaust. As you know, I was a member of the working group that drafted these recommendations. We were able to largely follow the structure of the other recommendations. So you can read it here: why to teach, foster historical understanding, critical thinking, and an awareness of the need to protect the rights and dignity of all minority groups. And what to teach, to incorporate factual historical content and concepts that enhance understanding of these crimes, their origins, and the lasting impact. And how to teach, to offer practical tools that empower policy makers, ministries of education, and educational stakeholders to address the challenges and opportunities in engaging with this history. However, from the outset, we were also aware that there are significant differences in how the subject has to be taught. First, knowledge of the crimes committed against Sinti and Roma is extremely limited. And second, the lack of recognition after 1945 and the continuing impact of Antigypsyism have left deep scars in societies to this day. They have led to exclusionary practices that continue to affect current generations. For this reason, greater attention was paid to teaching about the post-war period and the aftermath of the genocide. And there's also a third aspect that was important here. It was to integrate or to include Roma voices about the history of the persecution and, of course, about the current discrimination. So I think this is something very special. Now a short look into history. Like the Jewish population, Sinti and Roma were persecuted during National Socialism on racial grounds. Reich Minister of the Interior Wilhelm Frick pointed this out in his circular decree in January 1936, quote, "Apart from the Jews, only the Gypsies regularly belong to the alien races in Europe," end of quote. This led to a radicalization of the measures against Sinti and Roma that had already been in place before 1933. The total registration of the minority, systematic exclusion from society with, for example, bans on employment and schooling, segregation in detention camps, the systematic deportation of children, women, and men, and finally genocide in concentration and extermination camps. In countries occupied by Germany or allied with Germany, the murders mostly took place where Sinti or Roma were apprehended. This map, which can be found in Block 13 of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, provides an overview, albeit incomplete, of the locations of the crimes. By the end of the war, many communities had been almost completely wiped out, for example, in Estonia or Croatia. 90% of the Roma in Burgenland did not survive. Almost all Roma from Bohemia and Moravia were murdered. There were also only a few survivors in Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, other states, and in the states of the former Soviet Union and the former Yugoslavia. The survivors were severely scarred by their imprisonment in camps or their survival in hiding. They had often lost their entire families and were literally left with nothing. They could not receive back their homes or houses in their former places of residence, nor could they recover their former possessions. What's more, they often found that they were not welcome. The survivors had no lobby and were confronted with a cartel of silence and exoneration on the part of the perpetrators. After 1945, most of them were able to remain in their positions and determine how the crimes committed against Sinti and Roma were to be classified. This not only had consequences for the social climate, but also led to concrete disadvantages for Sinti and Roma in terms of compensation. In a fundamental ruling of 7 January 1956 on the deportation of May 1940, the Federal Court of Justice ruled, quote, "The resettlement of Gypsies from the border zone and adjacent areas to the general government in May 1940 is not a National Socialist measure of violence on racial grounds within the meaning of paragraph 1 of the Federal Compensation Act," end of quote. In a further ruling in 1959, it became clear that racist persecution was not only denied, but that the cause was to be sought in the victims themselves. The ruling states, quote, "A comparison with the measures directed against Jews is impossible, apart from the fact that only these are listed in the NSDAP party program, because they do not possess the characteristics that made G living in a G manner a national nuisance long before National Socialism," end of quote. This perfidious reversal of perpetrator and victim, everything that happened during National Socialism is the fault of the victims themselves, was extremely widespread and continues to have an impact in some areas to this day. One example is this text by Hans Eller of the Bavarian State Criminal Police Office from 1954. Well, it's hard to read it, but I'll do it. During the Third Reich, a number of G-like persons were taken into preventive police custody and incarcerated in concentration camps in part because of their antisocial behavior and in part because of their criminal lifestyle. It was only in 1943 that entire families of gypsies were ordered to be sent to concentration camps. Due to the lack of concrete documentation, it is impossible to specify to what extent and under what circumstances G lost their lives in the process. End of quote. Of course, it was a lie to claim that there was no information available at the time, but more on that later. Eller even goes so far as to claim that the high death rates in Auschwitz were solely attributable to the victims themselves. Quote, to the extent known, many G also fell victims to epidemics due in part to the inadequate accommodation at the camps, but also in part to the personal and innate uncleanliness of the individuals themselves. End of quote. Finally, he emphasizes once again that, quote, persecution on racial grounds cannot be acknowledged as such. End of quote. The perpetrators also managed to cover up the traces of their crimes after 1945. Hundreds of thousands of files that could have served as evidence were destroyed shortly before the end of the war, or at the end of the war. The files that remained were kept by the perpetrators. Survivors had no access to the criminal police department's filing cabinets. These contained the documents they needed to substantiate their legitimate claims. And another scandal was that these files were reused after 1945 for the unconstitutional special registration of Sinti and Roma by the police. The same applies to the files of the race researchers, the documents of the racist forced examinations during the Nazi era, photographs of deportations, portraits of hundreds of victims remained in the possession of members of the former Racial Hygiene Research Unit. They were used to write racist works at German universities. How can the loss be measured? This object, created by an artist based on an instrument by the Sinti musician Markus Reinhardt, symbolizes this great void. It is about the loss of human beings, and it is about the loss of what once belonged to these people and what they had created in their lives, and it is about a cultural loss. Under the Nazi regime, Sinti musicians were gradually excluded from cultural life. Bans on performing followed. Only a few ensembles, such as the Tanz- und Unterhaltungskapelle Eckstein, you can see here, were able to perform. But it was not long before these musicians were also persecuted and deported to concentration camps. Richard Eckstein the Elder, on the left, was murdered in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in 1942. Concertmaster Markus Eckstein, second from left, in the Lublin-Lemberg concentration camp in 1944. The cultural loss caused by the genocide cannot be quantified. Not only were the instruments passed down from generation to generation stolen from the Sinti and Roma families. Thousands of musicians who were the bearers of cultural knowledge were murdered, thus breaking off the transmission to the next generations. Many musicians who survived were physically and mentally broken and no longer able to practice their profession. They also lacked their former partners. It was not uncommon, like this example shows, for only one or two members of an ensemble to have survived. When the victims of deportation were taken from their homes, police officers inventoried their property. Here we see a list of the property of a Cologne Sinto who was deported in May 1940. The list includes 9 violins, a children's violin, and a bass violin. Such lists were filled out thousands of times, often inadequately and incompletely. Houses, households, goods, furniture, tools, cards, film or puppet theaters, valuable instruments, jewelry, cash and bank accounts, everything was taken from the victims. After 1945, documents needed to reclaim the property were often missing. This is another document proving the systematic nature of the spoliations. I'm showing it here because the theft of property from Sinti and Roma has not yet been addressed in provenance research. This is probably based on the idea that all Sinti and Roma were poor, which is a typical anti-Gypsy prejudice. The letter from the Berlin Gestapo was sent to the chief finance president of Berlin-Brandenburg on 5th May 1943. It concerns the property of 252 Sinti and Roma who were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Mention is made of cash, jewelry, and housing inventories, flats, and caravans confiscated for the benefit of the Reich. Now, a next chapter, historical justice. Historical justice requires that the victims be recognized and the perpetrators punished. Survivors demanded this soon after the war. Let us listen to an excerpt from a text written by survivor Matteo Maximov in 1946.
Matteo Maximov. 14,000 Sinti and Roma were massacred in a single night at the camp of Auschwitz, in the gas chamber, or in the crematoria. This happened in 1943, but who knows how many were killed before and after this date. Before the war, there were settled in the Balkans from 3 to 4 million Roma, and of this number, no one can trace how many have survived. For like the Jews, our race has been swept out of Europe by a nation of overlords who wanted to enslave all the nations they could not eliminate. We, the Roma, the freest people in the world, together with the people of the United Nations, we demand that the Roma martyrs at Auschwitz be avenged, like those of France or Poland, not by the fury of barbarism, but by the hand of justice. A tribunal of the United Nations, rather than the pages of this journal, would be the appropriate place in which to supply evidence in support of our charge against the Nazis, though we could summon but few witnesses, since so few Roma have returned from this inferno. But what we desire to find out is, what was the motive which induced these Nazis to carry out such wholesale massacres of our race? What could possibly have been their reason? Was it because we love freedom? Was this why they desired to remove us from the face of the earth? Or did they just kill Roma for sport? Shall we Roma, one asks, ever have an allied court of justice which will demand the punishment of these monsters, the assassins of 500,000 Roma? Since the United Nations desire to do justice to all the people who fought for the freedom of the world, why do they not consider justice for us also, and therefore institute an inquiry into the source of these monstrous Nazi orders to assassinate the whole Roma race?
So what became of this?
Matteo Maximo.
Oh, sorry. What became of this demand that the crimes committed against Sinti and Roma be dealt with in detail by an international court? Unfortunately, nothing. If at all, crimes committed against Sinti and Roma were only mentioned in passing at the Nuremberg trials. Very few Sinti were called as witnesses. Here we see the Sinto Ernst Mettbach testifying at the Nuremberg's doctor's trial. He was one of the victims of medical crimes at the Dachau concentration camp. The perpetrator, Wilhelm Weigelberg, was convicted but released in 1951 and was able to continue practicing as a physician. Hundreds of Roma testified before special commissions set up in the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and Poland. Their testimonies, such as this one by Milena Stankovic, who reports on the murders of her male relatives in German-occupied Serbia, are unique sources of information about the crimes committed against Sinti and Roma. However, very few of these testimonies actually led to the conviction of perpetrators. This is one example of the documents I curated for RomArchive, which was mentioned before. Sinti and Roma also testified as witnesses in the important Auschwitz trial, which took place in Frankfurt am Main in Germany in 1964. However, the victim witnesses received no support and were ruthlessly cornered by the judges, prosecutors, and defense lawyers. As a result, many of the statements that are still in the files today were not included in the verdicts. In fact, it was not only until the 1970s that a gradual change in perspective began to take place. This was largely due to initiatives launched by Roma and Sinti in various countries. The World Roma Congress, which took place in London in 1971, is now regarded as a major turning point. Many of the representatives gathered there were survivors. Some had fought as partisans, others were children of survivors. Therefore, the period of the Second World War and the question of reparations by Germany were also discussed there. However, the central agreement was to use the self-designation Roma and to reject all stigmatizing foreign designations. The meeting in London strengthened the Roma civil rights movement in all countries by linking existing movements in a transnational sense, and it encouraged other initiatives. For the first time, the fight against racism and the demand for recognition and compensation became a strong political movement that could no longer be ignored. RomArchive, the digital archive of Roma and Sinti arts and cultures, presents the Roma civil rights movement in various articles, but I think it is important to continue to expand and deepen this knowledge. There were so many persons, initiatives all over the countries that would be worth to be mentioned too. In Germany, an important signal was sent by the hunger strike organized by 12 Sinti, including 4 survivors. We see 3 of them at the Dachau Memorial Site from 4th to 11th April 1980. Among them were Franz Wirbel and Hans Braun, who survived Auschwitz-Birkenau, Jakob Bamberger, who had been a victim of the notorious seawater experiments in Dachau, and Ranko Brandner, who had been forcibly sterilized. This event received widespread coverage in the international press and also marked an important turning point. Finally, thanks to the negotiations of Romani Rose and the Central Council of German Sinti and Roma, the genocide was officially recognized by Germany's Federal Chancellor Helmut Schmidt in 1982. He stated, quote, "The Sinti and Roma suffered grave injustice under the Nazi dictatorship. They were persecuted on racial grounds. These crimes meet the criteria for genocide." End of quote. However, it remained the responsibility of the survivors to remember the crimes committed. Without these initiatives, the genocide of the Sinti and Roma would indeed have been forgotten to this day. Here we see survivors at the memorial service in the former Auschwitz-Birkenau camp in 1985. These events were organized on their own initiative and received little support at the time. We see in the front left in this wheelchair Hildegard Lagrenne. And using the example of Hildegard Lagrenne, who was deported from Cologne in 1940, I would like to show how important the impetus provided by survivors was. We see her here during a public lecture in Cologne in 1989. A year later, on the 50th anniversary of this deportation, the artist Gunter Demnig drew a trail writing across Cologne. He wrote, May 1940, thousands Roma and Sinti, end of quote, thousands of times on the asphalt, starting at the detention camp in Köln-Bickendorf and ending at the deportation platform in Cologne-Deutz. This action caused quite a sensation. In December 1992, Gunter Demnig laid a small memorial stone in front of Cologne City Hall. It commemorates the infamous Himmler decree, which is the order to deport Sinti and Roma to Auschwitz-Birkenau. This action was linked to the struggle of Yugoslavian Roma at the time for the right to remain in Germany. In this context, they drew attention to the fact that they too were survivors or descendants of persecution and genocide. These actions were the starting point for the so-called stumbling stones, Stolpersteine in German, that have now been laid throughout Europe. It is often not known that the first stones were laid for Sinti and Roma who had been deported from Cologne. We see here these plaques, these stumbling stones, and at that time in 1994, when these stones were laid, some Sinti did not want that their names are written there. And until today, it is different. In some cities, the names are written where the families allow it. And in other cities, it is not common. And I think it's a very interesting method to raise attention on the genocide of Sinti and Roma. Today, there are more than 100,000 stones laid across Europe in memory of all victim groups. And I know that stumbling stones for Sinti or Roma are laid in various countries, Italy, Czech Republic, Austria, of course, and others. And I think it's a good means to take initiative on the local level and to commemorate then these crimes on the local level and to make them visible. Often it's the first time when these stumbling stones are laid in smaller villages, especially, it is the first time that people start to research what has happened there. So it's an important initiative from the bottom up. In the following, I would like to ask how we can remember the aftermath of the persecutions and the struggles for recognition today. And as was said in the introduction, of course, autobiographies and biographies play here a very crucial role. Now, today, numerous of them are available. It started in the late 1980s, beginning of the 1990s. And as the situation in the countries after 44, 45 differs very much from country to country, and in order to get a complete picture, I think it is worthwhile exploring many different life stories to see how life went on after 45 and how people had to struggle for re-establishing a new life perspective. Since the 1990s in particular, there are also interviews with Romani survivors, and they have been conducted by various initiatives like these video recordings here from the Fortunov Video Archive for Holocaust testimonies. They were taken in 1991, but also the USC Shoah Foundation has a huge holding, the Wiener Library in London, and of course, a lot of Romani NGOs who collected these interviews. This database of testimonies of Roma and Sinti from the Czech Republic is absolutely unique. It is an attempt to collect and make accessible all the testimonies available for one country. I would like to use this example to address an aspect that is central to the struggle for recognition. Over the years, there has always been a lack of material resources to research or exhibit the history of the genocide and, in particular, to systematically collect the testimonies of survivors. Although there is the Documentation and Cultural Center of German Sinti and Roma in Heidelberg, or the Museum for Roma Culture in Brno, these institutions are far too small to function as an international documentation center. So what is still lacking today is a community-based institution that could take on the functions of collecting, publishing, and remembering, such as those fulfilled by Yad Vashem for the memory of the Holocaust. Yes, and I think this would be very crucial for the next years, centuries, and for preserving and collecting this material. We need at least two things. Or three things. We need the initiative, we need the money, and of course, we need trust. We need to build trust and to get together maybe and to reflect on how this could be possible. But I think it's really crucial to take care that these important testimonies won't be lost over the next years. Yes, as has already become clear, life stories of great importance in communicating the now 80-year struggle for recognition. It is also important to highlight the individuality of the life stories and the diverse strategies of survival and continuing life after 1945. Offerings such as these stories of resistance particularly emphasize the agency of Roma and Sinti, and it once again highlights the role of survivors in combating for recognition. This web portal, which is operated by Erinnern.at in Austria and is available in 12 languages at least, also deals with the post-war period. It started several years ago, and it was also financed by the IHRA. Here we see what they present for the period after 1945. Among several life stories, they also cover the topics recognition, compensation, and commemoration. But of course, this is a platform which is made for schooling. They have a huge pedagogic information there, but when it comes to content, it is always one or two, three small examples. So you won't get the overall picture here too. So this online exhibition by the Documentation and Cultural Center of German Sinti and Roma addresses already the long struggle for recognition in its title, as you can see here. This opens up also a topic that I have not yet discussed here, the racist violence that Sinti and Roma have suffered in all European countries since 1945 and continue to suffer to this day. The photo shows the state funeral for 4 Roma from Oberwart in Burgenland who were victims of a Nazi bomb attack in 1995. They had tried to remove a sign that read, quote, "Roma back to India," end of quote, and were killed by a bomb that was deposited there. A second example addresses the so-called ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, which affected around 100,000 Roma in the 1990s. To this day, many of these people live in unprotected and undignified conditions, also in Germany, but of course in other Western and Eastern European countries too. Finally, let us return to the map of crimes. This map from the Encyclopedia of the Nazi Genocide of the Sinti and Roma that I added is gradually being filled in with all the places where Sinti and Roma were imprisoned, tortured, or killed. It shows not only the concentration and extermination camps, but also the detention camps and the many hundreds of sites of murders outside the camps. Remembrance culture needs places where memories can be anchored. That is why it is so important not only to document these places, but also to bring them to life as places of remembrance, to mark them and hold events there. Well, I did not intend to introduce the encyclopedia here, but as I see we have still some time, I just want to say this is a living map. Whenever we receive information in the text, so we have now, we are online, but we have only edited roundabout one third of the content. And this encyclopedia will grow step by step. And with each lemma or article we present there, we fill out this map. And later you can then link from this point on the map to this text and find information about this site. So what you can see here, mainly in the middle, all these red dots, these are the massacre sites in German-occupied Poland, the part of the so-called general government. Here we worked on the data that were collected in the 1990s and that are nowhere presented in such a way. These are 180 places where Roma, most of them Polish Roma, but also some German Sinti, had been shot from 1939 to 1945. My aim is that we fill out all these informations we find and collect them in the encyclopedia so that we know what happened in these places step by step. And I think this is important because we need these sites. We have to mark these sites. We have to put something that remembers the incidents there. And then, of course, very important is that there are, different actions that are undertaken. For example, remembrance. A central goal of the German civil rights movement was therefore to ensure that the Central Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, which had been planned since the 1990s, also commemorated the Sinti and Roma. But we all know that this plan has failed. Sinti and Roma were not included in the Holocaust Memorial, but instead it was agreed that Sinti and Roma should have their own memorial. It took then 20 years from the decision in 1992 until the memorial was erected. But since 2012, there has now been a central memorial site in the heart of Berlin. The genocide can no longer be forgotten. The memorial has become a place of remembrance, but also a place of protest. People gather here to protest, for example, against racism and injustice. The open-air exhibition, which complements the memorial and opened in 2022, is also a place of information. It provides an overview of the persecution and murder of Sinti and Roma throughout Europe. It shows also, well, I think 9 biographies and one small section is dedicated to the situation after 1945. So has everything been achieved now? We know that this is not the case. One example of how states can deal with the negative legacy of their history is the Independent Commission on Antigypsyism. It was established by the German federal government in 2019 and produced a comprehensive report on anti-Gypsyism after 1945 with numerous recommendations. And you see here the key demands that the Commission wrote down. So first, the appointment of a commissioner against anti-Gypsyism and establishment of an independent advisory board. This took place already in 2022. Second, the creation of a permanent commission for exchange between the federal government and the states. This also took place. A comprehensive recognition of the Nazi genocide of Sinti and Roma. So here the government asked whether there wasn't a comprehensive recognition. To my mind, I think it would be very important to stress that Sinti and Roma were persecuted on racial grounds since 1933, because you have seen the examples before. All these persecution methods that were undertaken before, for example, 1939, they were not seen as really racial persecution. So I think this is something that should be done too. And of course, this commission to investigate the injustices committed against Sinti and Roma in the Federal Republic of Germany after 45, this would be very, very important. And the former commissioner against anti-Gypsyism, he already started the process to establish the commission. And we all hope that now the new commissioner will, well, fulfill this task. So, and of course, the other two aspects, recognition of Roma refugees as a group particularly in need of protection. This relates especially to Roma who fled from former Yugoslavian states and who are still for 30 years now in a very insecure state in Germany. And last but not least, the implementation and consolidation of participation structures, because we all know that the fight against anti-Gypsyism needs structures and needs support, and that, of course, the civil society is the one who is fighting this struggle. So, and I think it is also the responsibility of the states to repeatedly reaffirm the recognition of the genocide in a dignified manner. An important event was the invitation of the German Bundestag to Soni Weiss to speak in plenary on 27 January 2011 on the occasion of the Day of Remembrance. And I think this was an incident that was recognized not only in Germany, but also internationally. It was really a very important incident, and it had a huge impact also on German politicians. So last but not least, the European Parliament also took a significant step towards recognition when it designated the 2nd of August as European Holocaust Memorial Day in 2015. It took 30 years for the Civil Rights Movement's initiative from 1985 to be taken up and become part of Europe's official remembrance policy. It has been a long road, and it is a success, of course. But whether this is enough and what needs to be done next is something I would like now to discuss with you. Thank you very much.